Hello, my name is Katherine Inge, and I am the project director for a DRIP project at Virginia Commonwealth University. And that DRIP is on customized employment. And we've been doing research for about the last 4 to 5 years. And today I would like to share with you some information from a survey that we are finished collecting data and pretty much analyzed the data and are now getting ready to disseminate it. And so you are the first to hear the results of this study as you watch this today. So thank you for joining me, and let's get started. So oftentimes research is not the most popular topic, and I know that some people's their eyes might glaze over a little bit when they hear that we're going to talk about research. But I do think research is very important and that we do need research on customized employment. So I'd like to just spend a very few minutes talking with you about why we need research on customized employment, and hence the study that I'm going to talk to you about for a little bit. We said for a very long time it seemed that customized employment, is a new concept, but we really can't say that customized employment is a new idea much longer, because the definition of customized employment came out in the Federal Register in June of 2002. But there are a number of, I think, things that led up to that definition being published in 2002. And that's all of the wonderful work that was done across the country to move the field to best practices and employment outcomes for people with disabilities. So ODEP, the Office of Disability Employment Policy, was really the big first champion of customized employment. And they funded a number of early demonstration projects, and I want to keep this short, so I'm not going to really go in depth about those demonstrations. But those were done to really begin to spread the information about the ideas of customized employment nationally. And I couldn't mention sort of an overview of where we've come from in customized employment if I failed to mention Griffin Hammis and Associates and Mark Golden Associates, specifically Carrie Griffin and Michael Callahan, and all of the excellent people that work for those two organizations, and the early work that was done in the field that developed the concept of discovery and job negotiation that led to really the definition of customized employment. And it's important to remember as well that customized employment's foundation really, I think, is based on the whole person-centered planning movement, where we began to do a much better job at giving voice to people with disabilities, which, while we had done in the past, I'm not really sure we had done a really good job of it until some of this early work progressed, specifically person-centered planning. Sort of the next milestone that I'd like to mention is the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act of 2014 that actually included customized employment in the law for the first time, and it's in the law as under supported employment. And all of these things, there is information that you can read and review on this, and in fact there is a summary of this in the paper that will be developed from this research. And if you are listening to this webcast, when that paper is available, it will be posted on the DRIP website, and we will be sending an email to all of the participants to alert them that that information is available. So moving along in time, in 2017, WINTAC, which is the Workforce Investment Innovation Technical Assistance Center, and the Youth Technical Assistance Center put together a committee that developed the universal essential elements of customized employment for universal application. And we will provide you a link to that document on the resources screen for this webcast, and some of the other resources that I am mentioning. The next, which is the Discovery Fidelity Scale, which we also have a webcast on that we will link you to, that was done by Dr. Steve Hall. And I think that's another important resource for you to look at, and a great advancement for us, because if we don't focus on the features of customized employment and what that means for implementation, then we run the risk of not really implementing the service as it was intended. Finally, I would like to give credit to NIDLR, which is the National Institute of Disability Independent Living Rehabilitation Research, and they have certainly funded research in the area of customized employment, most recently the DRIP from which this research it originated. So based on just that overview of sort of where we've come from, and that was a really quick overview. So there's, as I said, much more to know about that, and hope I mentioned everyone that I should mention. But there are a number of research questions that really still resonated for me personally when I started thinking about doing research in this area. And really, I think for me, it also generated from a lot of the work that we do in training service providers in the field to implement customized employment. And I also hear a lot of questions and confusion around what are the critical features of customized employment. You know, how are they effectively being implemented? And so when I thought about designing a research study, these were the research questions that pretty much came to mind that I wanted to answer. And really all from the perspective of that vocational rehabilitation provider, specifically employment specialists, job coaches who are delivering the services. What do they think or identify as the critical features of customized employment? How effectively do they think that it is being implemented? Something that I'm particularly interested in knowing. And then, is there any relationship between the characteristics of the agencies, the service providers, and their perceptions of these critical features and how well they are being implemented? And so those were the research questions that I really wanted to have answered. And so from that point, it was, how are we going to answer those questions? And I think the decision was, well, let's ask them. Let's ask the individuals in the field who are actually providing these services what they think. That's a really good practice for knowledge translation, which in some ways, how does the knowledge that we know about customized employment, how is that going into the field? And I think that's a critical question too that we need answered, although this survey was not designed to do that. So where do we go to find the people that can answer those questions for us? And really we can go to APSE, National APSE, and we can also go to the Association of Community Rehabilitation Educators that have developed really a course, or not, I shouldn't say course, I should say quality indicators of providing services, and people can earn what's called an ACRE certificate. Now the ACRE certificate, and I won't go into great detail about this, but if you're interested and don't know anything about it, please contact me. But people can take a course that has been reviewed by ACRE, and ACRE certifies that your course meets the competencies that professionals in the field need to meet in order to provide quality services. And so really the idea was, let's go to APSE to look for a sample. Let's look at ACRE. VCU has been offering an online course on employment for individuals with disabilities really since the late 1990s, 1998 I think it was. But really, probably in the mid-2000s, we began actually offering a certificate. Now, this is a certificate of completion, not a certificate of competency. So people participate in an online course, and they receive a certificate if they meet all of the requirements for that course. Now, since 2003, we actually have a listserv that includes all of the participants who had registered to take our ACRE course. And that total number was 4,388 participants. Now, excuse me, since that number went back to 2003, we really had some idea that not all of those emails were going to be valid. When we sent out an initial request to participate in the survey, we had a number of emails returned as undeliverable, and we ended up with a listserv of 2,723 valid emails from which we requested people to participate in our online survey. Now, these people were from pretty much every state in the United States, and we had a requirement that the respondents, the participants, had to be at least 18 years of age, and reside in the United States. So that was part of the process when they went online to read about the survey initially. The other list, or the very generous participation of APSE, National APSE, was that they also agreed to participate in this survey, and they identified 1,056 emails to which the request to complete the survey was sent. So, excuse me, our final sample size was, a little under 4,000 individuals received the survey request to participate online. In that request was a link to the survey. The first part of that survey was a brief consent where we told them about what the survey was trying to accomplish, and they agreed to participate. So of those surveys that went out, we had 527 people who participated and took the online survey for approximately a 14% response rate. So I think it's important to remember that we did have a fairly good response rate, but it's still a small sample size based on the overall population that we requested to complete the survey. And this was not a random sample. It was really essentially volunteers who agreed to participate. So that needs to be kept in mind when we think about the results of this study. So the survey was developed really by looking at the customized employment literature, by talking to the national experts in this field based on our own research in customized employment. And then once we developed an initial draft of the survey, we sent that out and had it reviewed by people identified as national experts and asked for their feedback as to whether they felt like these items really got at the heart of what customized employment implementation is all about. So there were actually 4 sections to the survey. The first section we called really discovery elements, or the discovery activities related to customized employment, and that was 18 items. The second section of the survey was really around job development, job negotiation, and that included about 15 items. And in this particular section of the survey, we asked people how critical they thought the activity was for service delivery, and we also asked them how well they thought it was being implemented. So those were the 2 overreaching questions that were in Section 1 and Section 2. I should mention, while we're talking about this, that we have provided the actual survey in the resource section of this webcast so that you can download the survey and look at all of the items, because I will not be talking about all the items in the survey, because we might be here a lot longer than you'd want to be here if I told you about the responses to every survey item. In the area where we asked people how critical we thought the activity was, we gave them 5 options. It was a Likert type scale. And they were able to say whether they were unsure, that they didn't think it was critical, they thought it was not very critical, critical, or very critical. And a same 5-point, not the same scale, but a 5-point scale was also asked about implementation. And that was that it wasn't being implemented at all, poor, fair, good, and excellent. What we ended up doing for data analysis was that we collapsed the item for how critical you think this activity is into 2 categories, which we call not critical or a critical activity, and for how well it was being implemented into not well or well. In the other 2 sections, we were interested in knowing how often they provided services, because while how often you provide services may be somewhat linked to how well you think it's implemented, it's really sort of a different thing. So in that situation, we asked them, did they never do it, almost never, occasionally, almost every time, or every time, as well as how often. And when we asked those questions, we also asked if the individual personally provided customized employment services, and it resulted in 273 respondents out of the total that said that they actually provided customized employment services. So those analyses on how often you provide services was only done on the 277. And then, 273. And then the last section was characteristics or demographics of the respondents and their agencies. And we'll look at that a little bit later on, related to how we did an analysis. I'm not going to read all of these items on this scale. I'll give you a second to, on this slide, because I know sometimes it seems rather boring if someone sits and reads to you what's on the slide. But as far as the discovery items, as I believe I just previously said, there were 18 items that were identified as features of discovery. And I think you would probably recognize some of these items on the screen here. As you look, discovery begins with a home visit. That's probably one of the real key elements of discovery that you often hear about. And that those activities are individualized, that we don't do formalized testing within the confines of customized employment, but we replace that with really getting to know the individual so that we learn about their skills, interests, and preferences that way, and that employment specialists participate and observe with the job seeker so that they get to know that person. Really, as my friend and colleague Carrie Griffin often has said, the whole hangout with intent purpose, that I don't have a lot of time to get into today, but really the whole issue of getting to know that individual and what their goals for employment is. The sample 15 items for job development, those sample items really, again, I think that you might recognize some of these if you implement customized employment. I think they're some of the critical features. That businesses are specifically contacted on the behalf of one job seeker, that we don't do hit or miss and just try to find jobs and then put people that we are trying to assist in employment into jobs that we find, that we're not scouring the communities for open positions. Again, you know, that whole trying to fit a square peg into a round hole kind of thing. thing as an analogy. But really, really customizing and negotiating jobs for individuals, as in customized employment. I think that one of the things that I so often hear when I hear people describe the whole job negotiation, customization piece of customized employment, which has always concerned me, and I guess I digress here, is that that old way of doing business where we identified jobs first and then identified people who might be interested in doing them. But really, it's kind of like doing discovery with the job seeker and discovery with the business so that we can match those two together and customize a position that really meets the need of the business while it meets the needs of the individual. But unfortunately, much too often, I still hear examples of people talking about going into businesses and finding jobs and then and they call it a customized job, and when in fact it's not a customized job. So I digressed a little bit there, but anyway, that's why I think, really discussing these kinds of things is very important, that we discuss them within our agencies so that people really know. I mean, we can say businesses are contacted on behalf of only one job seeker, but do the people that are implementing that really clearly understand the implications of that practice? So in Section 3 of the survey, we were basically interested in how often things were taking place. So how often do you conduct a home visit? How often do you use social connections of the job seeker to identify businesses? How often do you create individualized opportunities for the job seeker to job shadow or participate in work duties that match the individual's skills and emerging themes? And again, there were a number of items in this category, so these are only representative of the sample items from Section 3 of the survey. So let's take a look at some of the results of this survey. And the first part I'm going to talk about really are the frequencies and numbers of the participants who responded to the different sections. And I think we always have to interpret these with caution because we're going to look at individual items. I do think it's kind of interesting personally to look at some of the items and look at the range of respondents' perceptions as to whether these are critical activities or not. And again, the really good takeaway point, I think, from this survey, especially as far as the identification of the critical activities of discovery and job development, the majority of the respondents or participants in this survey identify the activities as critical elements of either discovery, job development, and essentially critical elements of customized employment. Within the 18 discovery items, there was a range whereas I guess there was a range of about 70% of the respondents. That was the lowest percentage of respondents that identified any item as critical, to a high of 96, almost all of the participants identifying a discovery activity as critical element of discovery. So it's really kind of interesting to look at that, and one of I thought a surprising thing to me, I guess, the lowest item, or that one that ranked about 70% of the participants thought it was critical, and although 70% is, that's about 3/4 of the respondents thought that discovery begins with the home visit was a critical element. Now, we're not asking participants, remember, if they can do a home visit. We're just simply asking them if they think that it is a critical activity. So we do have 30% of this sample that feel that it's not a critical activity of discovery, which to a certain extent, I thought that percentage would be higher. So that was the lowest. And then the one that the most participants, or almost all of the participants, agreed that a meeting with the job seeker and his or her support network, along with the VR counselor and the employment specialist, was really critical as far as discovery is concerned, for implementing discovery. So if you're still with me there, and you're thinking back to something that I said earlier in this presentation, we asked them whether they thought it was a critical activity, and we also asked if if they thought it was implemented well. And that was really where I think I was a little surprised, because you think, well, I'm not really going to want to say something's not implemented well. In fact, someone said that to me when I first began discussing doing a survey, and the comment was made, well, nobody's going to say that it's not implemented well. Nobody's going to want to admit that. But in reality, it's really interesting to note that as far as the discovery features that we listed, there was a range of about 37% to a little less than 60% indicated that that element, or really the highest percentage that an element was implemented well, was less than 60%. So people out in the field that are implementing customized employment, what this test says to me, with caution, of course, is that we still have some concerns about the implementation of, or those service providers that are actually doing customized employment have some concern about the implementation of customized employment. So if you look, this was the item that really participants said was implemented the least well. So only about 37% of the participants said that this feature or element was implemented well. And that is that community rehabilitation providers do not use the same predetermined work experiences that all job seekers rotate through to identify work preferences. Now, based on what I hear often from people that are out doing this work, that doesn't surprise me, but it may surprise others, because I do think in practice many agencies may still be identifying work experiences, and then all of their job seekers rotate through those experiences. Now, can I say that based on these findings? Well, no, not really, but I can say that there is concern about the implementation of this very critical feature, because what obviously we want to do is identify job shadowing experiences, work experiences, opportunities for job seekers to really participate and experience work within the context of those individuals' vocational themes, not generic work experiences that everyone does. Another fairly low-rated item as being implemented well was, and it kind of relates to the previous one, is that the amount of time spent on discovery is guided by the needs of the individual and not predetermined or determined by the agency or funding source. A couple of others, and I don't want to belabor the point too much, other than to point out here from these different examples, it's important for me to note that the participants in this survey are saying that these are critical activities, but really that they are not being implemented well. At least around 50 to 60% are saying that it's being implemented well, and so there's a large number that are saying that it's not being implemented well. Within the context of Section 2, which were those critical elements of job development. Again, we see the majority of the participants responding that they think these are critical elements, with the lowest item being around 50%, of the participants saying that that was a critical element. And let's look at a couple of those. Again, not trying to read these off the slides, but really thinking about that whole concept of individualization, that a lot of people don't necessarily see the need for not using open positions in businesses for the purpose of customizing a job. However, almost the entire sample felt that you should use discovery findings for guiding job development. As with the discovery elements, the job development elements, again, the respondents, there was a much lower percentage of respondents felt that those were being implemented well than thought that they were a critical activity. And you can see that in this first example of job development activities are individualized through conversations with the job seeker and families, as far as how many thought it was a critical element and how many thought that it was actually implemented well. Giving you a second to just scan down the list here. The employment specialist does not identify open positions in businesses for the purpose of customizing a job. Was identified as the one that was not implemented well. Section 3 again was related to how often people, the employment specialist implemented these particular tasks. Within the context of these, I don't know, I think I briefly mentioned earlier on that this analysis was only done on the 273 respondents who identified that they actually provided services, customized employment services, really probably about half of the total sample. So again, you're seeing some low percentages here about how often they do particular activities. The lowest being as far as developing an employment proposal, and the highest being that they have meetings with the job seeker and familiar community locations of the individual's choice. I also mentioned earlier that we looked at analyzing these data by participant characteristics. And those two specific research questions that we were interested in answering was really whether there was any relationship between whether a participant identified a critical feature of customized employment or how well it was being implemented. And we looked at that across three characteristics. So we looked at it in relationship to whether the respondent had an ACRE certificate, a CESP certification through APSE, and whether they had no certificate and or no certification. And then we looked at it based on the primary services provided by the agency and years of experience. So those were some of the demographics that we looked at as far as the responses to the survey. For your information, about half of the sample were employment specialists, and we had other categories, and I'm not going to spend any time talking about some of those other categories. We collapsed it into these categories. You can read more about that when we actually make the article available to you, or you actually look at the survey as well. You'll see the extent of the categories that we had. We also looked at what primary services were provided by the agency, about 60% said that they provided, their agency primarily provided supported employment and customized employment, and the other, a little less than half, provided really either non-work or non-paid experiences or sub-minimum wages. And so these were the primary services that we asked people to respond to. And we collapsed all of the categories, the first 5 on the list, into an non-paid and sub-minimum wage services category, and the other 2 items on the list as integrated services, paid employment. And the definitions were provided in the survey for people so that they would know that we were dividing this into non-paid, some minimum wage categories, and then minimum wage categories. Within the context of certification, we had about 35% of the sample had received the ACRE certificate. We had a small percentage that had the CESP certification, and I'm sure that those individuals came to us from National APSE, from that component of the sample, because the CESP certification is an APSE certification. And we had a good number that actually had both the ACRE certificate and the CESP certification. And then a percentage that had neither. So what are the results of the analysis across the survey? I think a really interesting finding for me, maybe not so aha moment, but that respondents with a certificate, either ACRE or CESP certification, were almost uniformly more likely to report implementing the elements of customized employment well. Respondents working for agencies that provide primarily supported and customized employment services also more frequently reported that those elements were being implemented well. And then there was no significant differences found for those respondents based on their years of experience, which is actually a very interesting finding since, oftentimes we think that there's a lot of high turnover in the field. Now, I can't conclude that this is a positive finding, but that there's a very high turnover in the field, and that maybe we don't see those years of experience. In this sample, it didn't really seem to have an impact on the results. I'm just going to show you a couple of the items. Again, these are a few items off of the survey. I'm offering them up as some representative examples of items that that an individual who had an ACRE certificate or an ACRE certificate or a CSP certification are more likely to report as implemented well than those who did not. And for any of you who are interested in knowing this, the statistician did a Pearson chi-square test to achieve these results. As far as integrated services, we see a similar trend in that they were more likely to identify the services as implemented well. Now, this finding makes sense to me, because if you're comparing individuals who are doing integrated employment activities versus those who are in non-paid volunteer experiences, work, etc., then those people would not be implementing those services as it is. So It seems like sort of a common sense finding to me. So what are the takeaway points from all of this? I think there are a lot more than we could cover in the 30 minutes, 40 minutes that we have to talk about the survey, and I've probably skipped some really important points that I thought I was going to mention, and I didn't. So I would say here, before I forget to say this, that if anybody's really interested in this and wants to talk to me about it, I would love to talk to you. It's kind of my favorite topic at the moment. But I think we still need to remember that even though the participants who have an ACRE certificate or CESP certification, they're more likely to report that the CE elements are implemented well. I think there's still concern about implementation. There are a lot of people saying that these elements are not being implemented well. And I think we see similar findings within the context of the job development activities. The same is kind of true within the context of how often do you provide or do a particular element. So sort of a glass half empty comment would be that there were a lot of items that less than 60% of the sample said that they did it most of the time. They did that activity most of the time. More glasses half full approach might be that we could say 3/4 of the sample actually are saying that they implement the critical features of supported employment, customized employment most of the time. So I think there are, pros and cons. And again, we have to interpret some of these findings from the standpoint of that we're looking at frequencies. Can we really come to these conclusions? I think it gives us some preliminary things to think about, some sort of preliminary takeaway points to think about what more research might be needed. So I think I might have touched on some of these study limitations previously, and perhaps one shouldn't get to the end of a presentation and talk about the limitations of your study. But I think it's also important to point these out to people, that our sample was not random. People essentially were volunteering to respond to the survey. So you might criticize the results by saying that the people who took our survey were interested in this topic, and we don't really know about all those other people that chose to click on their next email instead of taking the survey. I think the most important thing that we need to consider from this survey really is related to the fact that we've kind of got a snapshot here about what might be going on, but we don't really know why. Why aren't services being implemented well? We did not ask people, to tell us why the services were not being implemented well. So I think that's really critical and important to think about. So based on this survey or this report, we haven't done any observation of respondent behavior. Maybe that's a need for future research. What are people actually doing? People can say they're doing one thing or that they think one way, but are they actually doing what they say they're doing? And the other thing is it doesn't really measure knowledge of those essential elements that are in this survey. And I mentioned that previously. We don't really know, although one of the reasons that we had selected the sample that we did, or the pool of people to pull from for the sample, was that we were assured that they had been exposed either through APSE or through the ACRE endorsed training, that they had heard of what these elements were. So we don't really know what their knowledge of those elements were. So in closing, what does this really mean for me? I think what it means for me, or you, I guess, will have to decide what it means for you. But I think we need to analyze what our programs are doing. Can you look at perhaps the discovery fidelity scale that Steve Hall developed in collaboration with Griffin Hammes and Mark Gold and Associates? I believe they were heavily involved in the development of that. Can you look at that and see how you can use that in your agency to really look at your services? Can you even look at the survey items that you now will have a copy of the survey? Can you look at those items and see what you think is critical in those items and how well your own agency is implementing those items? Can you look at the WINTAC, the universal elements of customized employment, also posted for you to review? Can you look at those universal elements of CE? Can you really begin to have conversations within your organization around how often you do these features of customized employment, how well you think you're doing them, and how well are you implementing them? So I think we need to have conversations around what these things are and ensuring that they're being implemented well. As far as what does this mean for future research, I think I've mentioned a few things related to that. I think it would be very interesting to do some look into knowledge of service providers around the critical features of customized employment, as well as observations around implementation. Probably, a pretty big industrious project to get into. And perhaps if I have piqued your interest enough, and you are a researcher listening to this presentation today, you could perhaps think about where you might like to go with your future research on customized employment. I would be remiss in not acknowledging the people that are on this screen as far as the development of the survey, the implementation of the survey. Dr. Tim Risen at Utah State University, Nancy Brooks Lane, Carrie Griffin, all were instrumental in helping me evaluate the items that were on this survey. National APSI, certainly thanking them for really giving us access to their membership, NIDLR for the funding that they have provided, and of course the individuals that took the survey. So I hope that I have given you some food for thought this afternoon, and that you find this interesting, and that you go out and can think about customized implementation in your own agencies and in the community. And thanks for joining me.